to all of you, welcome on behalf of the Crawford County Historical Landmarks Foundation. We are the organization that operates Belmont, but also from the Alabama Historical Commission. This property is one of 5 house museums owned by the state of Alabama, and we're so grateful to have this real architectural gem here in the Tennessee Valley in the Shoals area, and we appreciate so much your coming out today. We're especially excited about this Celtic festival, and having you out today, doesn't that get you fired up to come back tomorrow? I surely hope that many, if not all of you, can be with us tomorrow for the world-class music that we're going to be privy to and get to enjoy tomorrow. I hope you all picked up one of these little brochure, little schedules for tomorrow, and you'll read more about the home, more about the schedule of events for tomorrow. I especially want to say that we are grateful for the sponsors for this event, and the Daniel Foundation is one, the Alabama State Council on the Arts, Alabama Humanities Alliance, and the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area, which is responsible for this program this morning. We are also thankful for the City of Tuscumbia, for Parks and Rec and the Police Department. We are grateful for the Volunteer Fire Department that will be here tomorrow. And some of our other sponsors are Coldwater Inn, the Valley Credit Union, Pettis Pipe and Plumbing, Tuscumbia Civitan Club, and especially to several individuals, most importantly, Stuart McGregor, who I think is here with us today. Stuart, we thank you. And also Trish Williamson, Dr. and Ms. Angelo Mancuso, and Chan and Jennifer Smith, Mark Eady, and a number of anonymous patrons of Celtic arts. So I want you to know that before we go further. And then I'm happy to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Carolyn Crawford and Dr. George Makowski, who are both professors at the University of North Alabama in history and in public history realms, and both are extremely respected, as you probably already know. We are so grateful to have them here to share today their knowledge of our Celtic origins here in the Tennessee Valley. Dr. Alexander Mitchell, for whom this beautiful house was built by the extremely skilled enslaved African American craftsman, whose work is preserved today through first a generous donation of the property by members of the Fennell family here locally. They donated it to the state, and then through the efforts of the state of Alabama and the Alabama Historical Commission, with, of course, support locally by you all and the groups who support our programs and our events. And so now I want to introduce Dr. Carrie, as we call her, Carrie Crawford, who is the Executive Director of the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area, a federal program affiliated with National Park Service. Her territory covers a large area of North Alabama, an area that she has immersed herself in completely since moving here from Connecticut. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
By the way of Tennessee.
By the way of Tennessee. Making her way down just like the Celts did, right? And now she is one of us here in North Alabama, where we're extremely blessed by your work. And if you'll share more and introduce George, I would appreciate it.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out today. It's been so nice recently to actually be able to talk to rooms full of people again. I just did my first conference since before COVID in person a couple weeks ago, and it's just nice to be in a room of people and to be able to share the work that we do and what we have learned as we've done some research about immigration into the Tennessee River Valley, connected to populations in Scotland and Ireland and England. So as Ninon mentioned, I'm the director of the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area. We are a National Park Service funded program that covers the 6 counties of Northwest Alabama. These counties were or are, I always say were because Franklin County is not connected to the river, but the other 5 counties counties today are connected to the stretch of the Tennessee River known as the Muscle Shoals. Franklin County, prior to being split in two into Colbert County and Franklin County in 1867, stretched all the way to the river. So historically, there's a lot of similarities in immigration and connection to the river, so we included them as part of the heritage area. Heritage areas as a program within the Park Service began in the 1980s during Reagan's presidency as a way to essentially extend the mission of the National Park Service into communities, into lived-in landscapes. Heritage areas can range in size from our 6-county region to the entire state of Tennessee, which is the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area. So we're one of 55 around the country. And heritage areas are designated through an act of Congress. So it takes a lot of work. Over 10 years of work went into the formation of the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area. We're working on the Alabama Black Belt National Heritage Area right now, and they've been working for longer than 10 years seeking designation. So it's a long process to really make sure that the areas that Congress is recognizing are really worthy of this national level of significance. So the stories that we explore within the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area are connected to our music history, very important, and not just the Muscle Shoals music that we're really familiar with in the 20th century, the 21st century, but early music too, so we're excited to be a sponsor of the festival. We also help to sponsor the Athens Old Time Fiddlers Convention, and then we do a lot with contemporary music as well. We also share stories connected to Native American history and heritage. We work a lot with the Trail of Tears Association and also the National Park Service with their Trails program. The Trail of Tears runs through basically all of the heritage area. There were multiple routes that traveled through this region, and so we work on sharing those stories, but we also work on sharing the longer story of Native American history, which stretched back thousands of years before the Trail of Tears, and also our Native American history and culture today, what's happening in the heritage area today with Native people, Indigenous peoples. And then we also explore the river itself. And this happens in a variety of ways. We think about the river as a natural resource, as a recreational resource, and also as a cultural and historical resource, looking at how the river shaped life here in Northwest Alabama for thousands of years, stretching back and looking at Native Americans who first made their way here. And some of the earliest sites of human habitation in the southeast are here within the Tennessee River Valley. And so sharing those stories all the way through to the damming of the river and the story of TVA as well. And so the story of migration to this area is really connected to the river. The founding director of the Heritage Area always says, you can tie anything to the river. Judy Sizemore was creative in doing that. But really, this is why people came here. The river was a tremendous resource in terms of being able to migrate here, but also then to be able to ship goods from here that were produced here to other places very far away from the shoals. So what we're going to talk about today is, as Niman asked us to, is to look at patterns of immigration to this region, really from the borderlands and the highlands in Scotland and Ireland, and how and why people made their way here. So I asked Dr. Makowski to join me. We co-lead a study abroad trip to Scotland, which we have not been able to do for the past couple years, unfortunately. But we, in our work in Scotland, we work with Historic Environment Scotland, which is their national preservation agency, and we work on helping to document sites in the Highlands with our students and field documentation. So last time we were there, we got to map a stone circle, which was really fascinating. And so our students get the opportunity to work with a national preservation organization and also learn about the history and culture of Scotland, really focusing on the Highlands. But I asked Dr. Makowski to start us off by giving us a little bit of background that will help us to understand why people begin to migrate first to America and then to this region, and that helps us to better understand our connection to to British culture. So, without further ado.
Now we have a couple of seats still up here. If somebody wants to sit down, we've got at least 3. So you'll come on in if you want to take a seat. And I'm going to stand up because that's what I've done for a long time in the classroom. And so I'll be walking back and forth. That's partly to keep you from falling asleep.
He's going to call on you. He's going to make you answer questions.
There's a quiz on this later. So what I'm going to talk about today is Scottish migration in general up until about 1775, 1790, and then focus in on the people that never called themselves what we call them, the Scots Irish or the Ulster Scots, and who were not Scots at all by the time they got here. And that's probably as good an introduction as I can give, because we're going back into an era of chaos and an era that we don't understand. One of the books I was reviewing for today talked about how, in a sense, you have to abandon all hope, ye who enter here. If you want to understand these people, you have to give up on all science that you've ever learned, other than the simplest practical applied things, all technical knowledge that you have today, and all assumptions that you have about how the world works. And once you've done that, you're getting ready to understand who these people are. Because we're talking about a story that we're starting in 1560 today, and running forward. And their world, it was not our world by any stretch of the imagination. So, to give you a few numbers that Carrie will be picking up on, according to estimates from the 1790 census, remember our Constitution says every 10 years there will be a census of all people living in the territories of the United States. This is the first one, 1790. Working from that, historians have estimated that at that time there are 200,000 to 300,000 people of Scots background, recent Scots background in the United States. To give you an idea, that's between 8 and 10% of the entire population. In places like North Carolina, it approaches 15 to 17%. And this is of the white population. And this is a population, the only 2 groups in the United States in 1790 with larger heritage are British or English and German. So this is the number 3 ethnic group. The next time that happens is between 1880 and 1920, when immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe outnumber African Americans in the United States. And begin to shift electoral and other balances throughout the country. So this is a very big event. It's not just that many of you have names and heritage from these people. This is one of the great immigration moments in our history. So, what brought them here? We'll go into a lot of detail on all of these things. One is drought. A series of disastrous harvests in the beginning of the 1700s, something called rack renting that you may have heard about. Makes sense to us, but it was considered a horrible abuse of trust to the Ulster Scots and to the Lowland Scots. And that is when you had to renew your lease on your farmland, the landlord raised the rent. And that was considered a very deep violation of freedom and custom, because for centuries before, the rents were relatively fixed. And you had right to be on that land by custom, right, and relationship, not according to money payments. And third of these, well, 2 more, regulations on church discipline. We have to tread very, very carefully here, because in our history, this is distortedly spoken of as the issue of religious freedom. It's not really an issue of religious freedom, it's very much an issue of secular freedom. freedom. In other words, who tells congregations who they must report to, be responsible to, much more at a political level often than a spiritual or theological level. And last of all, a heritage of colonial migration. The people that come from Ulster, from Northern Ireland, to what becomes the United States, over about 150 years, 6 or 7 generations, had developed a culture of being colonizers, of displacing an indigenous population, maintaining power over them by violence and cultural and religious change, and it was not a difficult step for them to carry that forward. The closest other group in European history probably at this time are the Dutch, who become the Boers of South Africa and carry the same values to South Africa. So if you think about how that worked out in South Africa, you have a pretty good idea of how many of these Ulster Scots saw their life in the frontier of the South. So let's go into some details here. First of all, people didn't think of themselves as Scots necessarily. Scotland is not big, about the size of Alabama, and at that time is divided very intensively, again 1560, 1775, into different communities. They don't necessarily think of themselves as Scots. There are several different languages being spoken. First of all, there's English, then there's Scots, which is an English dialect, right? If you remember, you're not quite back to Chaucer, but a little bit past Chaucer, then you would have a pretty easy time understanding Scots. Then the northern, geographically almost half of the country, is speaking Scots Gaelic. Right? Maybe some English, but very often not. The further north you go, the fewer English speakers you find. So they're not united by language. They're not united by culture in many ways, because the Scots are the Johnny-come-latelys of migration into Scotland. They're preceded by waves of others over time, and they're the last ones. They actually are Celts that come from Ireland and conquer Scotland from the Picts, right, the previous group. If you like that Celtic quote-unquote jewelry, sorry, it's actually Pictish. And that's something that, right, came out of this blending of cultures. Okay, mixed group. And they're acting in the interest of their identities, not as Scots in some way. So who's coming to the New World, or specifically the 13 colonies, from Scotland in the period that we're talking about? Well, first of all, professionals, businessmen, trained craftsmen, military officers. Right? People who very often have at least what are called grammar school educations, in which they were taught Latin, possibly Greek, some basic numeracy skills, by the way, often not any writing at all in their vernacular language. This is one of the reasons that if you've done some genealogy, you've encountered some very interesting spelling, because many of them weren't taught to spell or write in English or Scots at all. Right? They learned Latin, possibly Greek. So that is one layer. These are people who are very assimilated into European culture. Many of them had spent time in Holland. Leiden is one of the great universities of Scotland at this time. And many of them had fought in different wars and served different governments around Europe, honestly, particularly in Poland, where my family is from, very, very large Scots immigration at this time, and in Russia, where some of the advisors to Peter the Great are Scots military officers and technical advisors. So they are going all over the place, right? Migration in many directions. There are other lowlanders, not so much from the east, right, the North Sea side, but from the west side, the side closer to Ireland. Then there are Highlanders, primarily from Sutherland. You've got to enjoy this, which is the northernmost part of Scotland. Anybody know why that is? Why it's called Sutherland? Because it was part of the Kingdom of Norway. And so if you're Norwegian, right, it's south. So Sutherland and Argyll and the islands coming, starting probably in the early 1700s, partly driven by what are called Highland clearances, which go on into the 1800s. But the initial clearances and other economic problems are pushing them out to the point that around 1750, 1775, if you went to North Carolina, there were areas where you could not communicate in English. Cape Fear River area was solidly Highlander. By the way, they did not join the American Revolutionaries. They were very offended by the American Revolution, and most of them were loyalists. So again, right, things going in all different directions. It's very hard to wrestle this to the ground. And then, of course, the people that we're supposed to be talking about today, right, those people who left lowland Scotland and went to Northern Ireland. There are later migrations, as you know, and lots of literature about that, driven by the potato famine, which is just as severe in Scotland as it is in Ireland, by the way, all the way across Northern Europe. Scots coming to be involved in U.S. Western expansion, and again, the continued clearance of the Highlands into the 1850s. So let's take a look at Scotland in this block, right, of time. What is our people's lives like? Why would they maybe want to go somewhere else? Because in the study of migration, you look at what are called push and pull factors. Right? Understand that migration, we have a big debate about migration in the United States today. No one does this because they want to. Migration is really dangerous. So some of the ships leaving the Highlands have 50% mortality. This is bigger than the Middle Passage for slaves. Right? People die in droves. Right? You are throwing dice with death when you get on a ship from Argyll, Sutherland, right? And head out for the New World. So this is not something, right, as the Book of Common Prayer says, not in a state to be entered into lightly. Right? This is something very dangerous, and so something's got to be pushing you hard. Right? So, example from my parents is because Hitler wanted to kill them. Right? And so it was a good time to go somewhere else. Right? So thank God we ended up in America. So let's take a look at Scotland. What are some of the conditions of life where we can get the push factors from? First of all, the issue of law and order. Okay. We're going to go through several different categories of law and order and conflict. First of all, there are kings and what I would like to call magnates rather than M-A-G-N-A-T-E-S. It's big landowners like the Duke of Argyll, right, and others. Right? The Duke of Argyll, by the way, the generation before this had the title of the King of the Isles. Right? Lord of the Isles, actually. So these are men of extraordinary power. If you think of it in terms of Alabama, this would be someone who, in the largest case, they essentially own Lauderdale and Culver County. Yeah. This would be their summer cottage. Later on. So, kings and magnates. The magnates don't see the king as anybody superior to them. And this is one of the great battles all over Europe politically at this time. Who's really in charge? Right? Are the local authorities in charge? Is there a king who is in charge? And honestly, in Scotland, well, there's no formal, well, there is a parliament. It's very much akin to what some scholars have called a republic of noblemen. right? There's Parliament, but you and I don't go to Parliament. We don't get elected. There's no place for us. This is a council of the most powerful men in the realm. And if they don't want to do it, the king doesn't get to do it. It's that simple. And on their own land, they do what they want. And the king can't do much about it. Now, over time, the king is trying to extend his claims over them, and that's part of the pressures that we're talking about, because that affects the little people who are the actual migrants. Then there's the issue of church and state. In 1560, the Scottish Parliament declared that the state religion of Scotland would now be Protestantism. They didn't ask anybody. You know, they didn't go out, into the towns and say, hey, would you like to become a Protestant? Yeah, I know you've been Catholic or a Celtic Catholic now for, 600-800 years, right? But this is declared by the Parliament. And this leads to a lot of chaos. Because, again, it's not by consent of the common people, it's by some very motivated clergymen working on the magnets to do this. Now, we're going to have some Sunday school in and out here. The kind of Protestantism is crucial to understand. What they want, this elite that is going to push this change, they want Calvinist Protestantism. They want not, if you know your Calvinism, they don't even want what John Calvin wrote in the Institutes. They want what Geneva was like by 1560. If you know, there's a huge change between what Calvin writes in the Institutes and the way Geneva is working by 1560, and the way Holland is working as a Calvinist republic by that time. That's what they want. Okay, why? Well, there are the issues of the degeneration of the Catholic Church in many different ways. But Calvinism had something crucial to offer. If you recall, one of the big issues of the Reformation is what is your responsibility to constituted authority? Right? All the reformers loved St. Paul. And remember, what does St. Paul tell us about authority? Come on, guys. All authority is from God. So be subject to the secular authorities. Right? That's it. Done. Nothing else. That's what Luther said. No matter how bad your government is, no matter how persecuted you are, you have no right to stand up against it, because that's a government that God put you under. Don't hear anything more out of it. So what John Calvin said. John Calvin said that the elect must live to the glory of God, and compel all others to live to the glory of God, whether they are elected for salvation or not. And that they must suffer an unrighteous government as long as it is possible. But then it becomes their godly obligation to rise up and destroy that government. If you are a big nobleman and you want to defy the king, what kind of Christianity do you want? You got it. Calvinism spreads across Europe to that level of people, because it allows them to defy the constituted authorities on the claim that they're ungodly. This is going to be really important to our whole story. All right, so church and state, are you going to have an Episcopal church, right, with bishops, right, as the Reformation in England was, or are you going to have a Presbyterian Reformation, right, a semi-congregational, right, led by people who do not have a historical claim for ordination. Right? These are the two things, and they're very tied to politics. Right? Kings like the Episcopal system because they're the ones who help choose the bishops. So they get high-power administrators all over the country. If you don't want the king to be powerful, you want Presbyterianism. Because then assemblies, right, and general assemblies decide all these things, and the king can't put his nose in it. So this issue of religion, right, you've got to put it in quotations. Yes, there are religious feelings, they're very strong, but they're also conditioned by these other things. foremost concern. Not in the sense of, you know, we've got Clan MacPherson or Clan MacDonald or whatever, but because the great leaders, right, these magnates, have created an iteration of the earlier clan structure. Your allegiance is to your landlord. He's the one that rebuilds your house if there's a fire. He's the one that gives you more livestock if something goes wrong and your cows die, right? And when he calls on you, you pick up your musket and your sword and you go help him settle things. Right? It's a very intense mutual relationship. And then on top of this, right, you have the Stuart dynasty, right, the Stuart kings, who after the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603, become kings both of England and of Scotland. And this puts them in a very, again, complicated situation. Okay, so much for law and order. Law and order is what you, your broadsword, and your landowner can establish. In the Highlands, that could mean massacring the people in the next glen. Yes, it did happen, not just at Glencoe, but in many other cases. It could mean fighting the king's troops. It could be helping your master feud against someone else. These are all parts of normal life. So particularly down in the borders, the southwestern borders, where again the Ulster Scots ultimately come from, this is a place where there is not guaranteed security of life. Right? There's constant battle, constant warfare, constant confrontation, but within the context of these groupings. So, also you could add to that, it's a very honor-bound culture, not just in the Highlands, but in other places, that a man who has freedom maintains it by not allowing insult or trespass on his name or his family. Right? So we're leaving this room and you jostle me intentionally, we're going outside with swords. We're done talking. Because you don't get away with that. Now we misinterpret what that means in the United States. You know, we think of this in our modern United States, oh, there's just a bunch of crazy people stabbing each other all the time. If you don't have honor, you cannot maintain property, you cannot maintain safety. Right? So these are all intertwined things. All right, so let's take a look here at economic poverty. Okay, this is one of the biggest push factors, both going to Ireland and then going from Ireland to the United States. First of all, Scotland is very far north. We are at a little below 35 degrees latitude here. Edinburgh is at about 55. So this is, Edinburgh is at the latitude of southern central Canada. It's really far north. Right now, it's light from 3:30 in the morning until 9:30 at night. And in the wintertime, it'll be light from 9:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon. And that's it. This is very, very far north, and that limits your economic opportunities. There are poor soils. There are very, very few places in Scotland with soil by our standard worth cultivating. It's hilly. What you can put out in terms of basic staples, these are grain-eating people, you can't grow wheat very well because it's too far north with the varieties that they have. You grow barley and oats. How do you remember that? What do Scots drink? Beer and whiskey, right? When you make it out, you make it out of barley. And what do they eat every day? Oatmeal, right? That is the grain that will grow furthest north. So, right, that's their life. Ale and oatmeal. That's the breakfast of champions, the lunch of champions, and the dinner of champions for most people in Scotland for a very, very long time. And their living conditions, some of you are old enough to remember perhaps what your grandparents lived like in the 1930s at the depths of the Depression. They would be wealthy compared to the living conditions of most Scots at that time. I want you to picture this room cut in half with ceilings this high and 12 people living in it. Oh, not all of it, half of it, because the other half is where the animals live. And if you're very prissy, you put a partition up, but oftentimes there's just a fire pit in the middle, and that's it. The floors are dirt, right? They're just covered with hay or straw or rushes by way of floor covering, and there's no chimney. It was a great innovation when they started making a smoke hole in the roof. And so it's full of smoke all the time, fire is burning all the time, and that is your home. Their lives were filthy. They were not believers in personal cleanliness. A yearly bath was almost considered a little prissy. Observers from other parts of Europe comment about the fact that they don't wash their hands and their faces at all. And if any of you grew up on farms, you know what you're handling, you know, you're milking, you're shoveling manure, you're not washing your hands, you know, you're eating. Right, infant mortality is very high. You know, you cut your foot in the barnyard, you may die in 2 weeks, right, because you've been walking barefoot. Yeah, mostly barefoot in the countryside. So very, very rough life. Now this is not much different from the life of lots of other people in Europe at that time, but it stands out as a baseline. And there's a big change that's going on that we mentioned when we talked about rack renting, and that is the interest of the big land people is becoming money, not men. Now, I have to step back here because, again, this is one of these things where you have to give up what you think about farmland. Okay, we have private ownership, right? That doesn't exist. You are a magnate. You may have 50,000 acres, and some of them do. Usually less than that, say 10,000 acres, you know, you're small. Okay, you own that land, which means that at some point a king or someone else that says, hey, do what you want with it. You don't have a title anymore. You don't have a deed that says, these are my 10,000 acres. Then you select people who are the farmers, or this very sort of middle people. You may know them as the lairds, L-A-I-R-D-S. These are local heads of things. Then they designate farmers, right, who take and work or are responsible for a certain area of land. Then under the farmers are the people who have the different farmsteads, right, house and fields, and work that. There is no paperwork. There are no deeds, right, until, you know, 1700 or so. It's really unclear. This is by custom, right, and by usage. Why? Well, the goal is to have as many men living on your land as possible. Because what makes you powerful is that when, in the Highlands, you send around the burning cross, which doesn't mean then what it meant later in the United States, you send around the burning cross, and all the men in your clan, right, who are the clan leader or the magnate in the south, all the men of fighting age show up with their weapons. So in the area of the Highlands where we've been, the MacLaren clan still maintains the Boar Rock, which was the rally point for their clan to go to war. Okay? That's what makes you powerful. I can bring 500 swordsmen tomorrow. And if the king wants to take something from me, he better bring more than 500 swordsmen, because he's not coming on my land. He's not getting what he wants. And if my neighbor is trying to take over a few fields, I've got 500 men that will burn out his farmers and slaughter them until I have what I want. That's the Scottish countryside. Right? It's not a nice place. But something starts happening around 1650. And that is, to play the power game, you need money, not men. because the kings of Scotland and the kings of England begin to generate royal armies that are not the collection of this magnate's 500 men and this clan leader's 100 men all brought together, but that are royal soldiers. And because they have taxes and resources, they can buy artillery, they can fund large cavalry units, they can buy firearms, and suddenly it's not a very good idea to send around the burning cross and bring 500 guys with swords, because the king can bring 5,000 men with firearms and artillery. But you don't want to lose power. And the power game is paid with money now. Money to influence government, money to influence the king, who's always short of money, to maybe start giving you an actual deed that says you own all of this, right? As we say in Russian, you know, you don't go if you don't grease the axles, right? And this is changing the world. Why? Because what do you want from farmers now? Yeah, you don't want 10 bushels of oats, 5 sheep, right, and 3 cattle every year and show up to fight. I don't care. I want money. And money means getting rid of men, right, and doing things like opening up land for sheep grazing or cattle. We undersell the cattle idea. England is growing rapidly in population. They want meat. Where are those cattle coming from? They're coming from Scotland. They're coming from Ireland. How do you get cattle land? Well, drive out here. How much cropland do you see? Right? A lot of people in our area don't grow crop anymore. Right? They've got cattle running. That means, right, you have to change the cultivation. You have to put people off the land. This is starting to happen in the by the 1650s. And population is growing. Why? Climate change. Regional climate change. Europe gets warmer, starting around 1650 or so. The end of what's called the Little Ice Age, a cold period of about 300 years. So food production goes up, right? Even if you're using the same primitive methods. People being who they are. If you want to think ecclesiastical concupiscence. People being what they are, they reproduce more, babies survive, population grows. But there's not more land, there's not more opportunities. Right? So, right, getting rid of men so you can have money, but the population is growing, but there aren't very many opportunities. Right? See, push you somewhere. What am I going to do? Right? What am I going to do now? So, mixed into this is the issue of religion, right? Remember 1560? Everybody's going to be a Protestant now. Unless you're in the Highlands, and Highlanders being who they are, said, well, no. We really don't like that idea very much. You know, in the area that we work in, you know, St. Filian showed up in around 600 AD, converted us, gave us our holy wells, our healing stones, and our liturgy. And so who the heck are you? You know, I'm sorry. You know, I don't, you know, I can't take you over and pull the kidney stone out, literally, they're still on display. The kidney healing stone, say the right prayers and rub them on your back and have you go away healed. Or bring your mentally disturbed child to the pool in the River Dochel that heals the mentally ill. Who the heck are you when our saint, when pestered by wolves, went out and ordered the wolf to help him plow his field and hitched him to his plow, or wrote the Gospels out with his right hand while his left arm glowed like a lantern through the night?
Yeah.
What do y'all have to offer? I mean, I'm not seeing it. Right? And so large parts of the Highlands are still Catholic. But in the areas that have been more and more connected with the continent, there's a revival kind of sense about changing the church. And so the Calvinist preachers go out and they begin having, well, revival meetings. Sound familiar? People actually do roll in the aisles. They jump up and down. They shout. They do all the things that we would see at, a big revival meeting. And people become convinced that this is a dynamic, interesting, fascinating way of being Christian. And at the same time, because the king is trying to tell them what to do, you think there's a good interest in being that kind of Christian? The king's trying to tell us to be part of the Anglican Church, conform to episcopacy, and John Calvin is telling us God says revolution is, right, what God wants. You're going to have problems right away, right? People with firearms and spears and swords who now believe that God has told them that revolt and resistance to constituted authority that is not Christian in their mind is their God-given obligation. And things start happening. Let's put it that way. That's about as kind as you can put it. The so-called Kirk, as it's called in Scotland, begins to take over the old functions of the church, particularly in the central area and the lowland area. Education is one of the great achievements of Scottish Presbyterianism, trying to educate as many people, as many males as possible to read and write, so that they can read the Bible, right? So they can participate in these religious assemblies. That is their great achievement. On the other hand, as one of our friend in Scotland, Lee Boyle, would say, this is the Scottish Taliban. And I say that very advisedly because they are watching everything you do. If your daughter goes out with a skirt 2 inches too short, you are going to hear about it from the Kirk sessions. Your name will be read out from the pulpit. A fine will be assessed by the Kirk sessions. They function as courts. They function as a police force. They function as a family court, some degree criminal court. They are in control of your life. It's a very, very different world than we think of. So all of that is the religious side of what they are living with. And connected with this is what is the power structure? Who's in control of all of this? And that is episcopacy, right? Episcopal authority or Presbyterian authority, right? And remember, this is about politics. If you have episcopal authority, then the stewards can make their writ run from Ullapool in the north right down to the River Tweed. If, however, you say Presbyterianism ought to rule, then it's the General Assembly of the Kirk of Scotland that decides what? Social policy, right? Religion, right? Literacy. And the king gets to say, oh, I'm so glad you did that. And it's this situation that leads to one of the biggest push factors of going to Ireland, what's called the killing time. In the 1630s, this issue of episcopacy or Presbyterian rule comes to a head, and Calvinists in England and in Scotland come together in an alliance called the Solemn League and Covenant. And this is a radical Calvinist alliance where they promise to, it's almost like the four freedoms when FDR and Churchill were talking about the beginning of early World War II. They're going to stamp out popery, bishops, and everything else that they don't like very much. Women in short skirts, public drinking, all those kinds of things. Kind of hard to do that last one in Scotland, but you get the idea. This is a combination of English Puritans and Scots Presbyterians. Well, King of England doesn't like that very much. Charles II, before Charles II, Oliver Cromwell invades Scotland in 1650. We think of him as the Puritan champion. He invades Scotland and said, y'all are going to have bishops. I've had enough out of y'all. And yeah, we'll just burn out your farms and kill you if you don't agree. Right? We are going to pacify the lowlands, particularly the western lowlands. The opposition are what are called the Covenanters, those who have signed or believe in the covenant. And they form, this sounds familiar, a mountainous area with bad soil, poor governance, and radicalized religious leaders who form an underground movement to fight a large incursion from a first world country. Right? And I'm making it sound like Afghanistan for a reason. These people don't want, and there's a guerrilla war that's going on until 1679, when there's finally a pitched battle where the Covenanters are defeated. So, life in Scotland sound like a happy thing?
No.
No, it's really terribly rough, right? You're poor, there's no opportunity, right? What you see as religious freedom is being stomped on, burned out with fire and sword. There are a lot of reasons to get out of here. That reason is offered in 1610 by James VI Stuart in Scotland, James I Stuart in England, who decides that after a long series of Irish uprisings, that Northern Ireland needs to be pacified. Now, step one is ethnic cleansing, right? Again, burning the farms, driving out Gaelic-speaking Catholics, laying waste to the 9 counties of Northern Ireland. Step two is, what are you going to do with it? Well, there's a plan. All over Europe, different monarchs are beginning colonization plans. In other words, bring in people from other places who are good at something. My original field was Russian history. Catherine the Great does this with Germans, who are also religious dissenters, brings them to the Volga, and they make the Volga flower. Right? So there's an idea out there building in Europe that you move people you can trust to settle land where people who you couldn't trust have been driven off with fire and sword. And this is what begins to happen in Ulster. Not individual lowland Scots are saying, hey, I'm going to buy a ticket. It's only 20 miles away, by the way, in some places. Or literally, I can row a boat over there and start a new life. But the big men, right, remember the big owners, are getting grants from the king in Northern Ireland. And then the big men are being given acreage and power depending on how many people they bring with them. So, if you are Protestant King of England, who do you want settling in Northern Ireland? You want Protestants, right? And you want to get these Covenanters the heck out of southern Scotland, because they're making a whole lot of trouble. And you start moving them over there. What is their job? Their job is to rebuild and destroy farms, right? Reestablish agriculture, and make sure that no Catholic Irish, Celtic-speaking Irish can come back. So you plow with one hand and you have a musket in the other. Every farmstead that's built has, this is one of the reasons that we have it in the United States, a farmstead and what we would call southwest where I grew up, partly a corral. Because you have to bring all your cattle in every night, or the Irish will steal them. Does this sound familiar? You build farmsteads and little forts. You build corrals out of stone. You have people on guard duty with muskets every night. And if you shoot a couple of those Irish, nobody's going to ask any questions, right? Because your job is to clean them out. Now, this is their life, the Ulster Scots' life. Remember, not one generation, but 1610 for some families until 1770. My family's only been in the United States since 1942. Some of you all have been here for a long time, right? Think about 150 years. Are you Scots anymore? Right? You may not speak Scots anymore. You probably speak English because that's the lingua franca of the ruling class. You've never seen Scotland, but when names start to change, so you would be MacNeil when you left Scotland. By the time you're coming to America, you're probably O'Neill, right? Because things are changing. And that rough Covenanter culture built on the following of powerful men, arms in hand, right, economic connections, is now been transformed. You are the people that go places where there are indigenous populations you don't like, that who don't like you, and your job is to get rid of them, right, and plant, and this is what actually it's called, it's the plantation of Northern Ireland. And you plant yourself and the new culture on them, and the devil take the hindmost. Now, why do you believe this is right? Well, first of all, because most people in history have believed it's right to do. But the second goes back to, right, Calvinism. We remember the tulip doctrine, you know, among other things. We're going to start with total depravity and march forward from there. Who will be saved? Those who have been ordained for salvation by God. Can you change that? No. Do we all want to think the best of ourselves? Right? So you have gone to Ireland, and these incomprehensible people who are stealing your cattle, right, clearly have been marked by God for what? For damnation. And who does God love? Who is God proving that they are members of the elect? Right? And remember, your job on the planet is to compel all to live to the glory of God, not knowing if they're saved or not, but God will be unhappy if people aren't living to the glory of God, no matter what. It's your job to make them do that. There's a very powerful set of ideas behind this. And these are the people who then, beginning in about 1720, begin to flood to the New World. Why 1720? Well, first of all, a whole series of really bad harvests. And second of all, because a huge wave of Scots went to the Ulster lands in the 1780s. And they were given 30 or 31 year leases on the land. Those leases ran out in the 1710s. Remember rack renting? What did the landlords do in 1715, 1720, 1725? When your lease came up, it was no longer, oh, you're building the frontier, we don't need that much money. To, yeah, you used to carry a sword for me, now I want 4 times the rent, 5 times the rent. And remember, Ireland doesn't have good soil either. Right? And so you can't produce that much. And there had already been a trickle of Scots from these same areas going to the New World. And they're sending letters back and saying, I came over here, I did my 5-year and 7-year indenture. I left with a musket, a plow, and a mule, and now I've got 50 acres of land. Now 50 acres of land in Ireland, you know, is unconceivably wealthy for a common person. So what do? You get on a ship and you go to the New World. And that's where
I start.
That's where Carrie starts.
So as Dr. Makowski mentioned at the start of his talk, there was about estimates range between 200,000, 300,000 immigrants to America from Ireland, Scotland, Northern England before the American Revolution. And that's a conservative estimate, I would say. There's probably many, many more who arrived as well. Like a lot of the migration patterns to New England, typically it's a family migration, so which is not very common when we're thinking about the Chesapeake, which tends to be initially a lot of young men who arrive on their own. But like Puritan families moving to New England, they migrated as a family group. And estimates of that range about 73% of immigrants from Scotland migrated as families, and 91% of people from Ireland migrated as families. So that family structure is really, really important to understanding how things play out in Scotland and Ireland before people arrive, and then down into the Appalachian region. So obviously, after hearing Dr. Makowski, we know why people wanted to come, right? They were looking for material betterment. They were looking for high sort of improvements in terms of wages, land access. They were very tired of paying a lot of taxes and rents, right? So they're seeking opportunity. And so while there is some degree of a religious motivation for migration, it's nothing like we see in other areas of migration to America pre-revolution. They're not fleeing persecution in the way that the Puritans were when they migrated to New England. So they really are looking for that material betterment, for that opportunity to improve their status in life. This group, really through the 18th and into the 19th century, faced a lot of prejudice when they arrived, and it may be because they were so dirty, right? But a lot of prejudice.
That does show up in the American document.
It does. And so they tend to stay in these very tight-knit communities, really family-oriented, clan-oriented as they migrate. There's a mixed social composition, as Dr. Makowski mentioned as well. You have people who are well-educated, who do have resources, who are migrating. But that's a pretty small percentage, probably about 2 to 4% of the total number of people who have migrated here. So those are the people who arrive with resources and opportunity. There's a lot of other people who come who are not unskilled laborers. They have skills. They may be farmers. They may practice a trade. There's only a small group of people who migrate who are unskilled, who don't have any resources. And compared to other groups of people, there's a relatively low number of indentures. I think about 20% of the population served some kind of indenture through that whole period leading up to the Revolution, which is pretty small when compared to other groups. And so when we're thinking about how they're coming, why they're coming, who's coming, right? Having all of that background again and what's going on is really important to understanding that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the culture of people, and then talk specifically about some examples from Alabama of people who are connected to this migration. So as people are coming in, the first waves come in really through Pennsylvania and then North Carolina, and then begin to push west pretty quickly. If we're thinking about the pre-revolutionary period, population is tightly pretty controlled along the eastern coast. But this group is comfortable sort of on the edges. David Hackett Fisher, who wrote a fantastic book, Albion's Seed, calls them the borderers, right? They're used to being on the border. They are used to existing sort of outside of the rule of law, and sort of that more comfortable away from power. We'll definitely want to be away from power in terms of control, right? So trying to push west to access land becomes sort of a characteristic of this migration. And they become, because of this desire, the dominant English-speaking group in Appalachia. Again, this estimate may be a little bit high, but in some areas over 50% of the population in the region through North Carolina, Virginia, North Carolina, into Tennessee, and eventually pushing into the old Southwest, which is Alabama and Mississippi. So very, very dominant culturally. A lot of the sort of ideology, the sort of way of life is rooted in sort of a fierce sense of independence, a fierce sense of pride, right? The culture of honor really shapes how people interact with one another and how they relate. And from that prominent group that I mentioned, that sort of elite group, we have some lasting impacts on the state of Alabama. President Andrew Jackson, the Bankheads, right, who as a family have a tremendous impact on Alabama through the 20th century. They're rooted in that group of people. Well, Andrew Jackson couldn't really spell or write very well. Rooted in that group that had a little bit more access to resources. a little bit more at their disposal than some of the poor people who migrated. In my research, I came across that the Bankheads were descended from a notorious borderland family well known for raiding and rustling cattle, right? So that's, again, who comes to dominate Alabama politics. And families intermarried, which was something that was very interesting across this group, right? People from Scotland, people from Ireland, people from Northern England. Once they arrive here, they intermarry, which is interesting because you think that oftentimes groups tend to stay very close to that original immigration pattern. So even though we think of Scottish and Irish and Northern English as sort of independent, right? They're not necessarily thinking of themselves as Scots, as Irish, as English. And so we do see intermarriage happening between the groups. They typically are conservative in terms of the real meaning of conservative, sort of reluctant to embrace change, often xenophobic, fearful of outsiders who are very different from themselves. So maybe they'd be okay with someone from Ireland, but typically don't like people who don't share a common culture or understanding of the world with themselves. They have speech patterns that come to dominate sort of how people talk across the South. I love some of the words that I was researching in terms of how people would pronounce things. So I might say hired, someone else might say hard. Fire, how would you say that? Bar, right? Naked, for naked. Winder, for window. Youngins. Patterns like he done did it, right? Is also sort of a legacy of this group of people. Double negatives, he don't have none, is a derivative of that. Fixin' to, that was one of those when I moved to the South, I was like, what does that mean? Right? But these are all words and phrases and things that sort of become dominant, right, across this region of the South. They, as a group, popularized the log cabin that was introduced by Scandinavians, but it's really embraced by people who migrate here from Scotland and Ireland and Northern England. It doesn't sound like they made many improvements from their homes in Scotland that Dr. Makowski was talking about. We had the opportunity to go look at a later dog trot cabin a couple months ago that was probably built post-Civil War, maybe. But it would have been very similar to what they would have constructed on the frontier of Alabama in the 1820s. 16-foot square log cabin, right? Chinked with mud, maybe a chimney. Maybe that was an improvement.
There was a chimney.
Yeah, chimney. The dog trot as a form is actually popular in Britain, right? The two sort of cells put together with a passageway between them. So that's something that they brought and just combined it with that log cabin construction that the Scandinavians had introduced. One thing that I found interesting in Albion Seed, which again, if you're interested in migration or immigration, it's fascinating. It was one of my favorite books that I read when I was studying colonial America as a grad student. He talks about how that's an architecture of impermanence, right? That it can be dismantled, it can be built readily, quickly, right? If you've got it.
Like the houses we researched in Scotland.
Yep.
Turf built.
Yep.
Or loose stone built with the crooks holding it up. All you can do is pull the crooks out.
And then it falls in.
You go on to the next place.
But he talks about that sort of as connected to the prefabricated homes that you see across the South, right? Which are sort of the descendants of this log cabin, right? They're affordable, right? They are impermanent, right? They are not something that's built to necessarily last, which I thought was a really interesting connection. And if we think about the Southern landscape today as a legacy of this wave of immigration. the history of feuding between families, between clans, is also carried forward here. Perhaps most famously in the South, right, the Hatwoods and the McCoys. But that type of feuding, right, that type of honor culture, that is really entrenched in Southern culture deeply. And I think that that's something that you can trace back to this wave of migration. In terms of gender roles, it's very interesting because this group of people have pretty defined understanding of what a man does and what a woman does, and what a man is and what a woman is. But there's a lot of things across the frontier, across the Appalachian Mountains into the Old Southwest, that people who migrated from the south of England would look at and be like, "You're doing what?" as a woman. Women butchered, women worked in the fields, women helped with forest cleaning or clearing, groundbreaking, which would have been similar to their experience in Scotland and Ireland, but different from the experience in other parts of England and then in other parts of Europe. And so there is a very defined understanding of that again, gender roles, but there was a different understanding of gender roles than other groups who migrated here. In terms of their child raising, they typically encouraged among boys to be very independent, stubborn, warriors, essentially. My husband is mostly Scottish, descended from
I ran across a great interaction that was reported between Andrew Jackson and his mother. Mm-hmm. Andrew Jackson was 7 or 8 years old, and he came to his mother crying, and she said, "Boys don't cry, crying is for girls. Boys will maybe do other things." And he said, "Mom, what do I do? You know, I'm a boy." He said, "Boys fight."
So that tells you everything that you need to know about Andrew Jackson. But my husband is descended from this group of people, right, who migrate here, and I can totally see all of those characteristics very firmly entrenched in him. Women are encouraged, instead of being stubborn and independent, to be obedient, patient, to make a lot of sacrifice, devotion to others. Boys, right, are treated with a great deal of permissiveness, given weapons and tools, right, at a very young age, and encouraged, right, to be really independent. I was thinking Seth out there just bought his 2-year-old girl, right, shotgun, right, so she's prepared, right, so he is violating, right, challenging these traditional gender norms, right, in this part of the country. But I think that's a really interesting way to think about how, if we look at the culture of the South and of Appalachia through the 20th century, it really makes sense if we think about this type of raising of children and the legacy of that, and how that shaped the South. Again, as Dr. Makowski mentioned, there was actually a pretty high rate of literacy among immigrants here, and when we say literacy, it's often defined by could they sign their name, right? So it can be a bit misleading, right? We don't know if they could read and write a whole lot, but they were able to sign their name. But it's at the same time a very, very strongly rooted oral culture. So storytelling, songs, ballads, right? As you'll hear tomorrow when you're here.
Family trees, remembering your family tree.
Yeah, remembering your family tree. Really the importance of being able to share that information with the generations that come after you is really, really rooted deeply in the culture as well. Food, okay, foodways. A lot of the foods that we think of as Southern, right, come from this group. So bacon, And that was actually something very interesting, right? They went from a culture who did not eat pork to really moving here and embracing pork and creating some long-term problems when it comes to our management of pigs today, because they would release them into the wild. The pigs would forage out in the woods. I just wrote a chapter of a book about the American chestnut tree, right? The pigs would go eat the chestnuts out in the woods, and then they'd round them up once a year and butcher them, which then, as it did with cattle, it sort of moved those back on an evolutionary scale, creating pigs that more resemble wild pigs. With cattle,
when they come from Scotland and Ireland, it's before the big period of selective breeding and breed improvement. So the animals that they would have been familiar with, you know, typical horse mate would have been under 1,000 pounds. You know, cattle somewhat smaller, and you know, the pigs would be almost like a razorback.
Yep. Cornmeal mush instead of eating oatmeal, which doesn't really grow very well here because it's now so hot, right? They shift a lot of their diet to consuming corn instead. Greens are an important part of their diet in Scotland and Ireland as well.
The foraging element.
Yep.
That you may farm, and some of you may remember this, but a lot of what you get at certain times of year are forage foods, like ramp salad in the spring, other greens, you know, fish at certain times of year, so that your farming is not necessarily what's making you living all the time.
Obviously, they also changed what they drank, right? The culture of whiskey drinking across the South, right, really rooted in this group. So instead of distilling from grains that they would have grown in Scotland and Ireland, now they're using corn and rye instead of barley. And so a shift in what they're consuming as well. Now, there's a lot of really interesting things too when we're looking at this wave of immigration, you know, to this region specifically. So we have people coming here and moving through this area, trading in the mid to late 1700s, but we don't really see a substantial Anglo-American population begin to grow until the early 19th century. And it's interesting, there's a number of very prominent people in our story here who have both Native American and Scottish or Irish descent. So the Colberts, Levi and George Colbert, have a Scottish father and a Native American mother. And there's a number of leaders within Native American cultures who share that. The Creeks and the Cherokee also have a number of people in other parts of Alabama and then in North Carolina who have that Scottish and Native American connection. But as we see that wave begin to arrive here in the early 19th century, it's a lot of people seeking opportunity again, right? You know, when Alabama opens up, they call it Alabama fever. And so we often think about that, especially in the Black Belt, with the real rise of plantation slavery. But it's also small farmers who are moving here who moved to America seeking to own their own land, but a lot never do, right? They are unable to purchase land. North Carolina, Virginia, it's a similar situation where there are large land grants given to wealthy individuals pre-revolution, and they then bring people to settle the land, but those people don't own the land. And so, you know, at post-revolution, we really see that continued desire to own land, which, you know, brings people like the Overtons who settle in Franklin County on Bear Creek. Brings people like that here who retain that real culture of Appalachia down into North Alabama. And so you see that in the Highland Rim on the, this part of Northwest Alabama into the Cumberland Plateau down into Bankhead. That real similar culture to places in North Carolina that are dominated by Scottish and Irish immigrants. And that was something that was very interesting when I moved here. It's like Alabama has the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, right? It didn't register in my brain until really I was here. It's like, oh yes, it is, right? And so there are so many shared cultural elements and historical elements that tie that whole region together. I think that's all I have to say.
But one thing that Carrie was mentioning, the land grants, a number of the big movements of the Ulster Scots, Irish, were exactly men that got big grants from the different colonies. And their contract fulfillment was how many families they could bring in. So one of the figures was 50 acres per family that they could bring in. And they would actually send recruiters back to Ireland to recruit Presbyterian Scots/Irish to get on the ships and come, partly because they wanted labor on that land, but also if they didn't fill up that land with people, they could lose their grant. So it's a lot of things tied up. Another thing on the religious front is that I think gave this group a lot of dynamism in the Appalachian frontier, and the frontier movement even continuing all the way to the Pacific, is their religious life does not require formally ordained clergy. In other words, if you're a Catholic like me, you may go to the frontier, but it's really a nervous thing to do because there's no clergy to take care of you, right? There's no clergy to administer the Lord's Supper, for you to confess to. And so if you look at French and Spanish movement, they're always bringing priests with them. But if you're Scots-Irish, you don't care. Because, again, it's the radical side of the Reformation, you and your Bible and the Spirit, and after all, you know that you've been foreordained for salvation, right?
You don't really
it's in the bag, right? So go out to the frontier and you don't worry about it. And if you think I'm kidding about this, if you know the history of the Baptist churches, for example, in Lauderdale County, they divide over this issue. Right, the old hard shell versus soft shell Baptist division. The hard shell saying, God's already decided, why are you wasting money on missions? Because God's already decided whether they're going to hell or not. You know, I can talk to you till I'm blue in the face. If God already said that you're saved and I'm not going to change what happens to me. I'm not going to change what happens to you. And many Baptist churches in the northern edge of Lauderdale County took that position. And others, as the 19th century goes on, are thinking, well, you know, maybe there are people out there that we need to reach. And we're not going to really decide on election all that precisely, but we should be doing missions. Right? But these people who come over, they have the conviction of their beliefs. They're not changing anything. They're going out there. If they can come up with a Bible, that's good enough. And again, this leads to things like some things you may be familiar with, that a church may be pastored by someone who has no formal education, certainly no theological education at all. Right? They are inspirited, they have the Bible, and that's all you need. And so this gave them a certain kind of dynamism.
And flexibility.
Yeah, they could go anywhere.
Yeah. Do y'all have any questions?
Yes, I have like 3 questions. Now, so these people that came over, most of them, they came over, they weren't indentured slaves. They came over with a promise that there would be a place.
Well, indentured is different than slavery.
I mean, they came over as just...
Indentured.
I know.
There were some people in the Scots-Irish migration, or particularly the lowland Scot migration, who were hesitant about indenture, but overall the sources are, this is a great deal. And there are letters back from the New World saying, go to the dock, find a ship captain, sign up for an indenture. You know, it's only, you're 20 years old, it's only going to be 5 years. right? While you're there, you're gonna learn how to farm, live, eat, and do everything else in the New World while somebody pays you,
Okay.
right? And then when you're done, obviously there was a lot of cheating, but, you know, if you got a decent master, then, you know, they worked your tail off for 5 years, so to speak, and then you knew how to live in the New World. And so for many of the Scots Irish, it was not seen as a demeaning thing, because remember where they're coming from? They don't farm their own land anyway.
Yeah.
They're someone else's man.
But it is interesting because as you see sort of the entrenchment of slavery in the South, the opportunities for indenture in the South decrease.
Down, yeah.
So the group that we're really focusing on, that's why we see a lower rate, you know, that are migrating into the South, because there's just not the opportunity. Whereas indenture remains an opportunity longer in the North than it does in the South.
So most of them knew,
There's a
they weren't
changing
indentures,
percentage
but
of,
they were encouraged to come here and work on the land. So they were, everything was paid for them on the ships. So you said a lot of them died on ships.
yeah.
Yes,
some-
and
Because of
Some of
disease
them
or,
are, disease.
okay,
There are ships that run out of food, run out of water. Of course, there are ships that sink.
yeah.
And it's going to be mixed in terms of, a lot of them are paying for their own passage. So that's why you don't see the very, very poor, but you do have situations, we were talking about landowners who are recruiting, right, who will pay for passage for people. So it's, I think that's the complicated thing about history is you can say, this is what most people are doing, but then
There's always.
49% of the people are actually doing something else, right? So
So-
there's so many different ways that people get here.
So the letters back are saying, don't worry about it, get indentured, do it. And then there are others that are saying the way to do this is to somehow get to the New World. You know, when you get here, you need to get into, because again, many of these, particularly the lowland Scots, the urban Scots, they can read, they can write. Find a merchant. It's like a Horatio Alger novel. You know, find a merchant, start out just, carrying lunch or whatever. Then let them, start copying out letters. Learn the business, and then see if you can branch out on your own, become a partner in the firm, right? Here's your pattern for success in the New World. Just get here, right? If you have an education, you can leverage that, right? If all you have is your strong muscles, you can leverage that.
But it was only like 20% that were indentured when came here.
I would argue that it varies by time.
Yeah,
If you look back at like 1780, 1700, there's probably a fairly high number of indentures, and then, again, as the custom of using black slavery for industrial, crop production goes up, then you don't need indentured Scots at the same level anymore.
and there's a real desire not to have
White people
White.
doing the same thing as black people.
Yeah. And then where did most of them land? In Pennsylvania or?
Pennsylvania and North Carolina were the two main points of
Okay.
entry. And then for those who, that arrived, that didn't remain in that East Coast section of the country, they were really pushing west as quickly as possible to find land.
They came to Georgia from
Yeah.
North Carolina,
Yeah, in two directions, from North Carolina and then down. A lot of them went into Pennsylvania, as Carrie was saying, headed straight west.
It was really weird because I lived in Pike County, Georgia for 30 years, and it came back over here and traced my ancestors back to Pike County and that area over there.
There's a reason why we have the North
But
Carolina.
I always heard in history classes, that your family first. Well, yeah.
No, there's a lot of things that are really visible. For example, I work a lot in historic cemeteries. Some of the cemeteries I've worked on in Lauderdale County, I went to New Lanark in Scotland, which is where Robert Newman had the model textile mills early in the Industrial Revolution. And the friend that brought me there kind of turned me loose to wander around, so I found the cemetery. I walked into it, and it was exactly what you would have found in an 1820s to 40s cemetery in Lauderdale County. The same kind of markers, the same kind of inscriptions, the same kind of distribution.
I have Scottish and Irish ancestors too.
I like to joke that my family came from Scotland, but that's because they were refugees in Scotland during World War II and then came from there to the U.S.
I think we're beginning to maybe need a little snack. We've got some Scottish goodies on the courtyard, water. We'd love for you to linger with them. Maybe y'all will come out on the courtyard and have